an article, you can't say, oh, it was for satire, therefore people have to know that it's for satire. But so with regards to impersonation, that is a new offense and an enforceable one. It's hard to tell, though, sometimes, and that's part of the challenge. And so that's where I also go back to the fact that for any advertising, there has to be that watermark saying authorized by the official agent of Karina Gould, Burgess Jagger, whoever the case may be, or the third party. And you have to be able to go back and find it. And the Commissioner of Canada Elections is tooling up right now to make sure that he has the expertise to be able to look into some of these things. But I think that deep fakes are quite worrisome, to be honest, because up until now, at least with regards to video, you could have been fairly confident that that was probably right, what you were seeing. And now you have to question that as well. And so sometimes I think that the best thing to do is to think to yourself, if this seems odd, it might just be odd and it might not be true, right? But at the same time, it's hard to know exactly. And I always think about like what led to this technology, and I think it's, they wanted to have like David Attenborough be able to like narrate your wedding video, right? Which like seems super cool, except that now you can do it with anyone, take their voice, take their image without their permission, and be able to manipulate it, which is particularly concerning.
We have a question over here. I'll just ask you to introduce yourself, and please feel free to ask your question.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Erin. So it's not specifically about the Canadian election, but more about keeping Canadians informed in terms of the cybersphere and the types of things that are happening there. Could you talk a little bit more about the conversations that are happening regarding the proposed changes to Bill C-59, empowering our Signals Intelligence Agency to do offensive cyber attacks? I know there are prohibitions within that bill saying we can't do any, pervert the course of justice and democracy and those things. But can you talk about that idea of having trust and what that means when we ourselves are concerned about our own elections, and yet you've seen a lot of Western countries kind of put our democracies ahead of others when it comes to these types of things? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I will start with a caveat in saying that I'm not intimately familiar with C-59 because that's more Minister Goodale, but I do have an overarching understanding of it. And part of what we tried to do was to create both citizen and parliamentary oversight with regards to our cyber capabilities to reinforce that trust. So one of the first things that we did was create the National Committee for National Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliamentarians that has parliamentarians from all of the different political parties. And it's not just limited to cyber, it's intelligence writ large. We didn't have this before. And so we actually have a mechanism now for parliamentarians to do really deep dives into the intelligence world and what we're doing with those capabilities and the information that is collected for them to do that oversight, which is important. And then we've also created kind of a super structure for citizen oversight that also has line of sight into all of those activities as well, because C-59 is really important for us to be able to keep up with what's going on in the cyberspace internationally, and to make sure that Canada doesn't fall behind and that we can protect Canada as a whole. But we also recognize that we need to have those oversight mechanisms to give people the confidence that that is being done in a way that aligns with our values here in Canada.
It's a fair question. So for those of you in the audience that don't know, C-59 is a major piece of legislation. It does a lot of different things that the minister has identified with respect to review and oversight of intelligence agencies. The question was about offensive cyber capability, and so maybe we'll turn the question around and suppose that there's a Russian server farm and you have credible intelligence to say that they're purposefully trying to influence the Canadian election. What are your options? Well, the difficulty, of course, is that the world is a rough place. And so all that law has done is authorized our cryptographic agency, the CSE, to go out and purposefully attack that server farm to knock it offline. And it's a shame that we have to do that, but that's the reality that we're dealing with.
And I think that, it's difficult, and all of these questions are tricky. Right? And I think that one of the things I wanted to say about deepfakes is that it should spur a conversation about ethics and AI as well, and what some of the things we're comfortable with here in Canada. And that goes to cyber as well. The capabilities and the activities that are going on online, we have to, as a government of Canada, our number one responsibility is to protect Canadians and protect Canada. And so we need to make sure that we are not in a vulnerable position with regards to adversaries that would seek to undermine our country. But then again, we also need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that aligns with who we are as Canadians, and that's the balance that we've tried to strike. So.
Please, we have another question.
Hi, my name is Bob. You've been talking largely about foreign interference in elections, but I'm concerned about domestic interference as well. And particularly, I'm thinking of electronic voting. Now, I know we don't elect officials with electronic voting, but parties do. There's been an allegation that the Conservative leader election in Alberta involved, the allegation is some misdirection of emails that would misdirect credentials of voters who would vote electronically. Because the federal parties elect their leaders electronically as well, are there rules in place or are there regulations that are being improved to ensure this sort of thing doesn't happen?
It's a really good question, and I thank you for that. So with regards to what happens in provinces, the federal elections law only covers federal elections. Each province has their own electoral body that will decide how they govern themselves. With regards to how parties run their internal operations, we have tended in Canada to leave that to the parties, although we do have rules in place for nominations and leadership contestants with regards to financing and disclosure requirements for that. And we brought leadership financing under the Elections Act with the update to the Elections Act this time around. With regards to how they vote internally, that's not something that we've done yet. But we did introduce a provision in C-76 that would make it illegal. We called it the malicious use of a computer, which sounds like a bit archaic, actually, in this context. But it's an existing criminal code provision that would allow us to extend any cyber interference to elections activities writ large, and that would be something that if there was a concern that they could bring to the Commissioner of Canada Elections, and he would have the tools now to be able to investigate it. But we don't prescribe specifically how parties run their leadership or nomination contests. But there would be a link that could be used if someone wanted to challenge that.
Yeah, and you'd indicated that as part of your institutional preparedness in C-76 that CSE is working with political parties, and that's what you want in a situation like this when you're dealing with foreign adversaries. So the cyber lingo is what they call active persistent threats. What that means is a government is on the other side. And that's really, really troublesome, because if someone goes to work and they swipe in with a military badge and they want to get into a civilian system, guess what? They're going to get into that system. I mean, the biggest companies in the world have been penetrated by foreign adversaries because the entire resources of a state apparatus are directed at that one goal. And so what we've done is allowed CSE, which is our national agency responsible for cybersecurity and protecting government networks, to work with political parties, because at the end of the day, this is not a hacker in their basement, it's a government that you're dealing with. And so that actually kind of brings me to a question that I wanted to ask about is, if we're talking about foreign adversaries, we've talked about individual responsibility. We've talked about the role of platforms. What about punishing the foreign adversaries? Is there any thought going on around that?
Sure, and it's a very complicated issue, because it necessarily brings diplomacy, trade relationships, a whole bunch of things into question. I will note, though, that you may recall, I want to say about a year and a half ago, there was a story that was being sent around that Chrystia Freeland, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, that her grandfather was a Nazi, right? That resulted in a number of Russian diplomats being expelled from Ottawa. Mm-hmm. So where there is a clear link and evidence, we will act. Part of the challenge is that sometimes it's hard to draw the connections. But I think there is a growing sense that this kind of activity is unacceptable, and particularly with regards to elections. And there's a difference between interference and influence, right? Influence is the ambassador of a country saying that, we would like Canada to do X, Y, and Z. It's out there, it's open, people know about it. Interference is this covert attempt to manipulate or interfere with people's decisions, not being open and transparent about where this information is coming from. And so there's always going to be tensions, right? Because there's espionage activities that take place that probably don't have much impact, right? You probably wouldn't identify a foreign actor in that case. But there could be a situation where there is a significant impact, and that's where our security agencies will make a recommendation as to whether or not this is something that needs to be attributed. Part of the protocol during the election is empowering a group of senior civil servants to both inform Canadians of what happened, but then also to decide whether or not they need to attribute that activity, if they have the information.
No, that's I think a fair point, and I've argued elsewhere that attribution in cyberspace is not a simple task, and it's not. There's a political dimension, there's an economic dimension, a legal dimension, and a technical dimension, and oftentimes you have to have all of those things line up in order to have attribution in cyberspace. We'll go to a question over here, please.
Hi, thank you. So this is less of a question, but more a comment on one of the first pillars, which is to have a resilient and informed and aware citizenry. So I work for a company in Guelph, and we've partnered with a Toronto-based news literacy organization, and we actually have a tool that is being implemented across schools K-12 across Canada, and it's called fakeout.ca, and it goes to your point about those very real-like or seemingly real posts, and how to actually source check. So they are designed for K-12, but I spent a lot of time in DC and with savvy lawyers and politicians, and we fake them out with our content. So it just goes to your point that we were the recipients and beneficiaries of your mandate to do that. So I just wanted to let people know, because it's not just young people. We all get faked out. So it's a tool that it gives you the actual tools to practice how to source check, how to take a picture and look back. And so that's one way that we can sort of arm ourselves and to help think critically and have the practical application of those skills. So
That's awesome.
thank you.
That's great. And that's really, so I mean, I think that's really cool, and it's really good to be able to arm citizens with the tools to help them kind of decipher what's going on online. Unfortunately, the biggest sharers of fake news are not students, though. They're baby boomers. So one of the challenges is students are a really captive audience, and so we can talk to them about